Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. On this episode, I'm exploring a dynamic of human decision-making that can lead to very undesirable outcomes. A cause, if you like, of human risk. Now, you've probably heard of cognitive biases, things like confirmation bias, where we have a tendency to seek out information that confirms what we already think and pay less attention to information that doesn't. And we know that biases can lead to really bad outcomes. But there's another dynamic that you might not have heard of that is equally, if not more, problematic. And that dynamic is noise. Noise is a useless variability in decision making. In simple terms, it's when people who are tasked with assessing the same thing reach varying conclusions for no good reason. An example would be judges giving vastly different sentences to defendants who committed the same crime. If some judges give a 1-month sentence, others 1 year, others 7 years, and others somewhere in between, then the system they're operating in is noisy. After all, we'd expect similar punishments for the same crime. Noise is the subject of a recently published book by 3 professors: Daniel Kahneman, Sunstein, and Olivier Sibony. Daniel Kahneman is best known for being the author of Thinking Fast and Slow, a book that brought the idea of cognitive biases to the forefront that many of you will own and a few of you might even have read. Sunstein is the co-author of Nudge, a book that led to the creation of bodies like the Nudge Unit or Behavioural Insights Team and led to the widespread adoption of behavioural science in government. The other author, Olivier Sibony, is my guest on this episode. He's been on the show before. There's a link to that episode in the show notes. If you heard it, you'll know that he's engaging and insightful. In my discussion with Olivier, we explore what noise is, why it matters, and what we can do to mitigate it. We also touch on a subject that I've always found incredibly irritating, and I know that many of my listeners, particularly those of you that I worked with where this was used, do as well. That subject is forced distributions in performance evaluations. In other words, a requirement to ensure the performance rankings you give to your staff are distributed across the available grades, effectively meaning you're forced to give some people grades that aren't the ones you'd actually want to give them. So if, like me, you think forced distributions in performance evaluations are a really bad idea, then stay tuned to find out why we're right. And if you're one of the people that's ever had a conversation with me telling me my evaluation distribution isn't acceptable, then you'll hear the argument I would have made instead of relying on gut instinct. If you're working somewhere that still uses it, I hope this helps you. With all of that said, please enjoy my discussion with Professor Olivier Sibony on noise. Olivier, welcome back to the Human Risk podcast.
Thank you, Christian. It's a pleasure.
It's an absolute thrill to have you back here. And last time you were on the show, we were talking about your book, and you mentioned the fact that you were in the process of writing another book, and you kindly offered to come back to talk about that book, and here you are. So can you tell us a little bit about noise?
And amazingly, this book actually happened, right? Because you know the planning fallacy. We have plans and sometimes they don't materialize, but this one did come out some time ago. It's called Noise. It's written jointly with Daniel Kahneman, who needs no introduction, and Sunstein, who probably needs no introduction either. And it's called Noise, a Flaw in Human Judgment. And basically, the story of noise is this. When we talk about bias, which I've been doing for a while, and which Danny has been doing for a much longer while, and so has Cass, when we talk about bias, we talk about shared errors. We talk about average errors. We talk about the errors that the average archetypal human being makes. But in the real world, there isn't a single human being making the same mistakes that every other human being is making. There isn't an archetype of the biased human being. There are lots of different human beings who make slightly different mistakes, and sometimes not so slightly different. And the variability of those mistakes, the dispersion around the mean, is what we call noise. The concept, as many of your listeners will recognize, is well known in statistics and in measurement theory. Bias is the average error, noise is the standard deviation of errors. So when we are making mistakes in judgment, just like when we're making errors in measurement, we should take care of bias, of course, but we should also take care of noise.
And so what would an example be for those people that haven't come across the concept before?
So let's take a very simple example from the world of measurement, because that really brings it to life in a much easier way. Suppose that you have a cheap bathroom scale, and the bathroom scale that you have is a little bit forgiving. It tends to give you, on average, a weight that is, say, a pound less than you actually weigh, which is probably good news. At least for me, it would be good news. But that's a bias. On average, the scale is wrong by -1 pound. Now, suppose that you also step onto your bathroom scale 2 or 3 times in quick succession, and like my cheap bathroom scale, it gives you a slightly different number each time, a slightly different reading each time. That's variability in readings that should be identical, because your weight has not changed from one stepping on the scale to another, and it may be caused by slight changes in exactly where you put your foot on the scale, or how briskly you jump on the scale, or those kinds of things. It has a reason. It's not purely random. It has a cause, but we don't know what that cause is, and for practical purposes, it's a random variation. That variability in measurement is noise. So bias is the average of the errors that your bathroom scale makes. Noise is the variability of the errors on your bathroom scale. That's the measurement idea. Now apply it to a judgment. For instance, a forecast. If we are all making forecasts, you and me and 98 other forecasters are making forecasts of what GDP growth is going to be next year. And on average, our forecast, what is called the consensus of the forecasters, the average forecast says GDP is going to grow by 5 points. And it turns out that, in fact, it grows only, we only find this out in a year's time, but it grows only by 3 points. We've collectively made a mistake. We've been biased in the direction of optimism. We've been too optimistic collectively about the forecast. But if you look at the 100 different forecasts, there's also a lot of variability. And if you look at the error that one particular forecaster is making, that error is not the average bias of the entire group of forecasters. It's the average bias plus or minus the noisy error that forecaster is making. And in each of our judgments, this is an example of forecasting, but any other kind of judgment would be the same, there is a bias, which is the average error that the other people making the same judgment are also making. And there is another component, a residual component of the error when we compare it to the true value, which in the case of a forecast will be known at the end of the forecasting period. And that component is the noisy error, which is in aggregate noise. And the point of the book is that if we want to improve the quality of judgments, just like if we want to improve the quality of measurements, we need to worry about bias, but we also need to worry about noise. We've talked a lot about bias. We're very concerned about bias. We hear a lot about bias, and we should. Bias matters. Let's be clear about that. But noise matters too, and we want to redress the imbalance in the amount of attention that noise has been getting compared to bias.
And what's fascinating is, I mean, you talk in those terms, and clearly scales that make me look lighter than I am, not necessarily a massive issue in the scheme of things. Or no. If it's a slightly variable, I can probably live with that if I bought a cheap pair of scales. But the point you make in the book is that this has some really serious implications. And so you look at lots of examples which are really serious, and you take examples of the medical professional, the judiciary, where actually this impacts big decisions that matter societally.
We've been struck by how many examples we could find, and we keep finding more, by the way. The funny thing is, since the book has come out, we get emails almost every day from people saying, here's noise in environmental assessments in Ethiopia. Here's noise in the judicial system in France. Here's noise in the medical diagnosis of benign prostate hypertrophy. Everyone who is faced with a judgment problem and who is thinking about it is having this forehead slapping moment where they say, oh my God, there's a lot of noise in the judgments that we're making. So here are some examples that we talk about at some length in the book. One that is especially striking and that I think brings the problem to life is the judicial system. And what's interesting about it is that unlike the example of forecasting, which I was using, or the example of the bathroom scale, There is no truth there. There is no, you cannot say that the correct, the right, the true, the objectively accurate punishment for defendant X, given all the circumstances of that person's crime and the extenuating circumstances of her life and whatever, you will never be able to say that the correct punishment is exactly 7 years and 3 months in prison and a fine of $42,500. That doesn't make any sense. There isn't an objective way to assess what the true punishment is. Does that mean that we should be content with noise and that noise is not a problem? Actually, no, it does not mean that. Noise remains a problem even when we don't know for sure what the true value is. Because here's what we found, or in fact, here's what a study found a long time ago when the US was trying to deal with this problem. This study took 208 federal judges and gave them 16 different cases, very simplified, stylized cases of actual crimes, but with a lot less detail and a lot less distracting stuff than you would actually find in a courtroom. So you would expect, given that the cases were actually simplified, that there would be a lot more consistency, a lot more agreement between the judges than there would be in an actual courtroom. Because in an actual courtroom, you could say, well, I see this guy and he really looks sinister. So yeah, it doesn't look bad on paper, but I really feel bad about him. I'm going, there would be a lot of stuff that would actually distract you or bias you.
So you've created, in essence, more laboratory-like conditions.
Not us. This was done by researchers back, several decades ago. But this piece of research was done quite seriously with vignettes that were actually clean cases. And so you would expect that there would be a lot more consistency in the judgments of the actual federal judges there than they have in their actual courtrooms. And it turned out that the discrepancies between the judgment of the judges were amazing. On almost all of the cases, there wasn't any unanimity on whether there should be a prison sentence at all. So some of the judges said you go to jail, others said you don't. On the average case, when the prison sentence was 7 years on average, the dispersion around that average was so wide that if you took the mean, if you took a pair of judges at random in the pool of 200 judges, so any pair that you can create from those 208 times 207 judges, the median difference between two judges would be about 3.5 years. So that basically means that the minute you step into the courtroom and you have been assigned Judge Christian or Judge Olivier, that means your sentence is 5 years or roughly 5 years or 9 years, just because of the judge. That has nothing to do with you, nothing to do with the crime, nothing to do with the victim, nothing to do with the circumstances, nothing to do with anything that we would regard as justice. I think that means we have a problem. We all agree, and I hope we all agree, that we shouldn't have automatic sentences that don't take into account the specifics of the defendant and the specifics of the crime and the specifics of that person's history and so on. I think we all agree in civilized nations that some degree of individualization of sentencing is required to take into account all those things. But I don't think anyone ever meant this to mean that we should individualize the sentence to the judge. It's fine to individualize the sentence to the defendant and to the crime. It's not so great to make it be so largely a function of the judge. And even though we don't know what the correct sentence is, we can all agree, I hope, that it's not good for that sentencing process to essentially be a lottery. And basically, it's a lottery. So that's the example of justice. We have a lot more examples. The example of medicine is striking because here there are true values. You either have a disease or you don't. The tumor on your X-ray image is either benign or malignant. And when you ask different doctors to look at those identical cases, they quite often have different opinions. And then there's another thing that you notice, especially in medicine, but also in justice, which is that even the same judge when presented with the same facts on two different occasions, is not always consistent with him or herself. The same person looking at the same evidence can sometimes disagree with himself or herself because the circumstances have changed. The person is in a different mood. The preceding case that the person has looked at was especially bad or especially easy. There is fatigue at the end of the day. There's all kinds of circumstances that affect our judgment in ways that we are vaguely aware of, but I think we greatly underestimate the magnitude of the effect that they have. So there's lots of examples. There's many more in the book, and there's, again, many more that we keep hearing about. There's noise everywhere. In fact, one of the mottos of the book is, wherever there is judgment, there is noise, and probably more of it than you think.
And I mean, it struck me that this is something that once you point it out, is you can see it, and I don't have to necessarily hear the case. I mean, those judicial cases are shocking, but I can sort of see it as I go around. And one of the things I found fascinating is you provided a lens through which I can start to see these things, and hence you've become what I would sort of noise hunters almost, the people who are providing eyewitness accounts for you. And so the first question I wanted on that basis, I mean, have you found yourself seeing this everywhere? Because it always struck me that sort of behavioral science is another, is a space where once things are pointed out to you, you kind of go, oh, and you're starting to see the world through that lens. Are you spotting this yourself everywhere?
A little bit. I'll give you an example. My grading as a professor, as a teacher. So, I've always graded, always. I mean, since I've become a professor, I've had the task of grading the essays of my students at the end of each class. And, I try to do it as carefully and diligently as possible. But actually, I've become aware. I've tested myself, essentially. I've tried to look again at essays that I had graded without actually putting the grade on the actual essay, and compared the grades that I was giving on two different occasions, and they were significantly different. So we'll talk about the remedies to noise later, but I've implemented some remedies, some cheap remedies, because this isn't a problem that is worth, and this is something we'll talk about too, I'm sure. This isn't a noise that is worth spending a lot of time and effort to reduce. These aren't essays that are going to change the life or even the academic fate of my students. These are just essays that are going to be averaged with lots of other things to come up with their GPA. It's not a case of getting or not getting admission into the school. That would be worth a lot of fine-tuning. So I've put in place some fairly easy solutions to reduce noise because I've become aware of it. But to your point, you were saying, have I become a noise hunter? Do we all become noise hunters? It's actually a lot less easy to spot noise than it is to spot bias. And that's, by the way, why we're talking about noise now, and we're saying it's a big problem. And it's a fair question to ask why this big problem has not been talked about more before, like bias has. And I think the answer is at least twofold. One reason is that we don't actually think about this a lot. When we're making a judgment, we're thinking hard about our judgment. When I grade an essay, I try to grade the essay right. I never actually asked myself, what would another professor think of this essay? I've only asked myself, what do I think of this essay? I've literally never asked the question, how would someone I know and trust and respect, but who is different from me, judge this essay? What would this person care about? Would this person be as impressed by the feature that impressed me, or as put off by the feature that put me off in this essay, right? That's the sort of mindset that you need to have if you want to reduce noise. But we don't have that mindset because of what psychologists sometimes call naive realism, which is that we basically assume that we see the world as it is because that's how it is. And we don't pause to ask ourselves how others see the world. We just assume that anyone who is sensible, well-meaning, and competent will see the world in the same way. That's how we remain oblivious to noise. We don't unless we're challenged by, in my case, I was challenged by the fact that I was writing a book on the topic. we don't, we don't stop to ask ourselves, am I being noisy here? Because we don't need to. And the other reason, which we may take a moment to talk about as well, is that organizations in general do a pretty good job of sweeping that problem under the rug. Basically, organizations are designed to hide noise, to mute noise, well, not to mute noise, but to pretend that noise is not there and to make sure that we don't become aware of it. Take the judicial system that we were talking about. If you are a judge and I am a judge, we see different cases. We never have the experience of actually judging the same case separately. Or if we work collegially, if there is actually several judges, if there is a panel of judges hearing the same case, they will actually talk to each other and they will come to a consensus and they will gradually gravitate towards a shared point of view. They will never actually have the experience of separately writing down what they think of the case and saying, oh my God, we're in complete disagreement. We saw a different trial here, which is probably what you would see if they did that experiment. That's what we call a noise audit, by the way. The experiment in the judicial system was de facto a noise audit. We've done several others. We found many other examples of noise audits. And unless organizations do noise audits, do experiments that expose the amount of noise, they don't actually become aware of noise. So, do we become noise hunters? I think we should. Part of the book is, one big objective of the book is to turn as many people as possible, and especially as many organization leaders as possible, into noise hunters. But it doesn't come naturally, which is why we haven't all chased noise before.
And what I found fascinating as I read it and as you're talking now, is that there are examples that we could pick from things that have been designed that in some level recognize this. So if I think of the devil's advocate for the appointment of the Pope, if I think about the idea of juries, and I recognize, as you were talking, I thought, well, there's juries. That's why we have juries, because we have but of course they sit in a room together, and there's plenty of movies that illustrate how juries operate in practice, which is they're required to come to agreement. So there's at least a recognition there that we need to start thinking about these things. So on the one hand, I'm fascinated by the fact that we have certain processes that have existed that have tried to at least start to deal with this issue. And yet, on the other hand, we are also willfully blind towards it. And I'm fascinated by your thoughts on that. Is it just because this is incredibly difficult, it's inconvenient to have to handle it? Or are we willfully blind to it, or are we accidentally blind to it?
I don't know, but it's probably sometimes willful, but I think most of the time it's accidental. I think most of the time we are simply not aware of the magnitude of the problem. We do have situations in which we have done things to combat noise. And in fact, all the remedies against noise that we talk about in the book have been tried and tested in one domain or another, and sometimes in several domains. There's two things that we should improve there, though. One is that we sometimes do it just plain wrong. So when we say, we have different points of view, so let's have a lot of people weigh in, which of course is what juries do, and which is what most companies do in their hiring processes. They have several people interview the candidate, and then they get together and they talk about the candidate and they come to a consensus. Or that's what we do in a management team when we have a strategic decision to make. We go around the table and we ask everyone in sequence to tell us, so what do you think of this plan? And they say, well, I think it's a good idea. Or they say, well, I've got this concern. And the next person piles up. And by the time you've gone around the table, the boss says, I've heard you all, and this is what we're going to do. And we think that this is the way to bring to bear the diversity of the points of view we have in the room. It's wrong, unfortunately. It doesn't work. That's not the way to reduce noise. That's the way to come to a consensus, for sure. And it will give you the warm, fuzzy feeling of having had a discussion and having brought everybody on board. But it, in fact, will amplify the noise. You were mentioning movies about juries. There is actually research about juries that we discuss at some length in the book that shows that juries will become more polarized, will become more extreme in their views after they discuss than they were before the discussion, which basically means that the random effects of the composition of the group will be amplified by the deliberation. And the and the reason this happens is because in the deliberation, the first people who speak have an outsized influence on the rest of the group, especially if they speak with confidence, especially if the rest of the group has reason to trust their point of view, which maybe in a jury is not so much of a concern, but in an organization is almost always a big concern, because organizations have hierarchies, they have experts, they have people who speak with confidence, etc. So that kind of deliberation, which we think of as a way to reduce noise, will in fact increase noise. You can reduce noise by having multiple inputs. You are in fact guaranteed to reduce noise if you aggregate multiple inputs, on the condition that these inputs are independent, that the judgments are made separately and independently of each other, and that they don't influence one another. If you do that, if you ask your 12 jurors in the jury room to set a sentence, and then you take the average of the sentence, you will have less noise than you have after the jury deliberates. But of course, that's not how it's done, and for other reasons, it probably wouldn't be a good idea. So, long story to try to make a simple point. We think of some ways to reduce, we think of some of the approaches that we have, especially of deliberation, as ways to reduce noise. They are not so great at reducing noise. The second part of the answer to your question of why we don't reduce noise so well is that I think we greatly underestimate the magnitude of the problem. So here's a story which we talk about also in the book. We talk about an experiment in an insurance company where we worked with the underwriters and the claims adjusters, people who make quantifiable judgments. They say, this insurance policy should be priced at 100,000 euros or at 80,000 euros or 110,000 euros. And they're experts. They are not just pulling the number out of thin air. They're saying, I am applying a method. I have rules. There's a procedure. There are norms. I've been trained. I'm an expert in this topic. But of course, there are several experts, and they're essentially interchangeable. Whether your quote is going to be given by expert A or expert B is a function of who happens to be available when your request for a quote comes in. And we asked the management team of the insurance company, how much difference do you expect you would find between two underwriters or two claims adjusters, those are the people putting a price on the claims, between two experts who are applying the same method and are looking at the same case? And they said, well, of course, we don't expect them to agree perfectly, right? We realize that this is a matter of judgment. And when we say a matter of judgment, by definition, we imply that some degree of disagreement between reasonable and competent people is to be expected. We can't expect perfect agreement, but we expect that roughly something along the lines of 10% would be acceptable. And from a business standpoint, that would be tolerable, and that would reassure us that basically these people have the process under control, that they're applying the same methodology. Do the experiment. What do you find? It's not 10%. It's not 20%, it's not 30%, it's not 40%, it's 55%. It's more than 5 times larger than what all the people in the organization were expecting. So the problem was not that they were unaware of the existence of noise conceptually. Of course, they knew that when you ask people to make a judgment, they are going to disagree. But they had no idea that it was that large. And this is the experience that we've had essentially everywhere where we've done a noise audit. Basically, people always expect that there is going to be some variability, but it's more than they think.
And in that case, way more than they think. That's huge by any stretch of the imagination, financially, and in terms of the outcomes it produces. And yet these are people that are experts who really should know, quote unquote, what they're doing.
Yeah, well, in all the professional judgments that we focused on, we're talking about professionals who are trained, who are experts, and who do not at all expect such degrees of disagreement. You do not expect radiologists to disagree on what they look at as often as they do. You don't expect, here's another one that is quite striking, you don't expect fingerprint examiners, people who look at fingerprints and say, oh yes, this is a match for this suspect, or no, this is not a match for this suspect.
So these are the ones that we see on TV shows solving those really difficult crimes, and they nail that criminal because they're really good.
These are CSI, yeah. I mean, these are the people we've been trained to consider as infallible, right? I mean, if you're in the jury box, and the defendant says, "No, I didn't do it. I'm innocent," and then there's a guy who comes in and says, "Well, it's his fingerprint on the murder weapon," you're not going to hesitate very long, right? You've been told that basically a fingerprint is a fingerprint is a fingerprint. You've been told essentially that this is not a matter of judgment, that this is a matter of fact. It's either his fingerprint or it's not. But basically, you expect that this is not a matter of of judgment. In fact, it is a matter of judgment. It is a matter of judgment because we think of fingerprints, and I realized that my idea of what fingerprints are was completely wrong when looking at the work of the researcher who studied this, called Etiel Dror, who is at UCL in London. My idea, and probably your idea of fingerprints, is what you do when you are at the border control, and you have this clean window where you take your designated finger, usually the right index, and you press it firmly to produce a clean image, which can then be compared with another equally clean image that you've created on another occasion. So that's very easy. That's not a matter of judgment, and in fact, it's automated. When you actually look at the fingerprint that has been left on the murder weapon or on the door handle in the crime scene or something like that, well, the criminal is not as careful about leaving a fingerprint as you are when you're at the border control. Surprisingly, right? I mean, he doesn't obligingly press
or she, we should add, right?
Or she, right? So it takes judgment to determine whether that partial, smudged, overlapping trace that has been left, called a latent print, actually fits the fingerprint that has been collected from a suspect. And those people are extremely competent, they're well trained, they're extremely careful. By the way, I should stress that when they make mistakes, when they hesitate, they always err on the side of caution, of not wrongly identifying someone as guilty. So they probably make a lot more mistakes that lead to unwanted exonerations than mistakes that lead to wrongful convictions, essentially. But we should realize that they're human beings. However competent, however well-trained, however well-organized, they're human beings, and their judgments are judgments. And because they are judgments, there is variability. Roughly, I mean, it depends on the circumstances and how you do the tests and who does the test, because oddly enough, when the test is done by the FBI, it seems to be a lot more, there is a lot less variability than there is when it's done by independent researchers. But basically, somewhere between 5 and 10% of the time, you're going to have a different judgment on a pair of fingerprints. That's not a lot. Of course, it's a lot less than you have in the example of the insurance company, but it's a lot more than we expect. We would expect something very, very, very close to zero.
Right. You talked about sort of things that we don't think of as judgments. And if we move into the sort of sphere of ethics, where on the one hand, it clearly is a matter of judgment and there's a lot of nuance there. On the other hand, you can come at it depending on how you have been educated and brought up. You can have very, very, very different views on things, and therefore it feels less like a judgment. How does noise impact those sorts of decisions?
So there's at least two ways to answer this. The first is that within person noise, what I was mentioning earlier when I was talking about judges being in a different mood when the weather has changed, or professors grading essays who are tired at the end of the day or something like that. That's what we call occasion noise. That really shouldn't exist, right? It shouldn't affect your judgment if you're careful, but because we're human beings and we're not machines, it does. Does it affect your ethical judgments? You would think that your ethical judgments would be grounded in your fundamental beliefs and your reflections about the nature of good and evil and so on and so forth. It actually turns out that when you use things like the trolley problem or variants of the trolley problem, which are classic experiments in ethics, the answers that people give will vary depending, for instance, on their mood. Whether people act deontologically and or in a utilitarian way is affected by whether you have shown them a movie clip that puts them in a good mood or in a bad mood. This is bizarre, right? Because we think of ethical decisions within person as something that deeply reflects who we are and what we think and what we care about and so on. And oddly enough, we are a lot less consistent with ourselves in our ethical values than we would assume. That's one thing. The other thing is, ethics are, of course, a question of values, and different people can have different values and different priorities and can have different judgments. And there is no absolute truth there. What does that mean in terms of between-person differences? It means that your ethics and my ethics can be different. We can have a different judgment about how horribly wrong it is for, say, Volkswagen to cheat on its emissions tests, or how terribly unacceptable it is for a student to engage in plagiarism or something like that. We can have different views. The problem comes in if you and I both have to make decisions based on our ethics within the same organization. So if we are both members of different panels sitting to judge ethical violations in the university, and you and your panel think that a mild act of plagiarism is not a big deal. If it's a first-time offender, we should basically give this student a slap on the wrist and tell them not to reoffend. And I think it's a terrible crime against the ethics of research and knowledge, and the person should be expelled immediately. And depending on whether that person is assigned to you or to me, their fate is going to be completely different. The university has a big problem of system noise, because it should not make decisions based on the happenstance of who happens to be in the room when the decision is made. And it's completely normal and expected and fine that we have different ethical views as individuals. But when those ethics become part of the standards that are applied inside an organization, we want some consistency, we want some uniformity, we want some homogeneity in how the standards are applied, and we want those ethical norms to be defined in a way that ensures some homogeneity. Otherwise, we have a randomness which does not bode well for justice, and also, by the way, destroys the credibility of the organization. It's very hard to be credible in enforcing sentences against ethical violation if it's completely random, if it seems to, or if it appears to be completely random.
And I want to come on to talk about some of the ways that we can mitigate noise. But before we do that, I was interested in your views. I mean, it's presented in the book as a negative thing, something we need to look out for. But it occurred to me there might be circumstances under which actually it could be a positive force. And I wondered your thoughts on that.
Well, we solved this problem with a definitional trick. We've defined noise as unwanted variability in judgments that should be identical. So there are lots of situations where variability is not noise, or you would say where noise is not bad. We just say, well, it's variability and we don't call it noise. It's the same thing. And those would be all the situations, and there are a few. There would be all the situations where you want creativity, you want divergence, you want different people to pursue different ideas, and you would want that, essentially, whenever the variation is going to be followed by selection. So if you have 10 teams of researchers, either in different companies or even within the same company, who are trying to solve the same problem, say they are looking for the cure for COVID, you very much want them to be pursuing different routes, different avenues towards the solution, different technological ideas, different ways to solve the problem, because at the end of the day, you're going to see what works. And the one or the ones that work will win, and the ones that didn't work will lose. And that's how evolution, or the equivalent of evolution in the market system, functions. You have variation, then you have selection. Contrast this with the underwriters in the insurance company, right? You get assigned randomly to one underwriter or another, and you never hear what the other underwriters would have said, and there is no selection. The underwriter gets no feedback. He doesn't get promoted because he had a good judgment or demoted because he had a bad judgment. There is variation without selection. Look at the judges in the different courtrooms. If they have different judgments, they will never know. They're not competing against each other. So, there are some situations where variability is good and desired because there will be selection. And there are some situations where it's not good because it's not good, because there is no selection. There are also, of course, all kinds of situations where we don't care about variability, or in fact, we welcome variability. When you read several reviews of the same book, you want them to be different. When you read several reviews of the same movie, you want to hear that Olivier liked it, Christian didn't like it, and you want to hear why. You're interested to have different points of view. You don't want consistency there. You don't want consistency in tastes. Tastes are not a matter of judgment. Opinions are not a matter of judgment. You don't expect people to agree. Variability is not unwanted. It is wanted. So in anything that is competitive, that makes a market or that has a selection process, and in anything that is a matter of opinion or taste, variability is fine, and you want as much of it as you can. But we tend to forget that there are lots of professional judgment situations where we say, oh, diversity is wonderful, originality is great, being our true selves and bringing our authentic points of view to every problem that we encounter is what we are here for. And actually, that results in a lot of noise, which is a source of error for the organization, a source of injustice for the people who are exposed to its decisions, and a source of inconsistency and loss of credibility.
I was struck when you were talking about reviews. It was really interesting, actually, because that thing where you buy something and then maybe this is just me, you read the reviews afterwards to make sure that you've made a good decision. So I was laughing because I was thinking, before I buy a product, right, I want that variety. Afterwards, I just want people to confirm that I've made the right decision.
Well, here's an even bigger way. Don't read the reviews afterwards. Just read them before.
Right? Yeah, totally. We've talked a lot about the sort of the challenge of it. Can you talk us a little bit around decision hygiene and noise audits and some of these solutions to the challenge that we face?
Right. So we've talked a lot about the problem. Here's the good news. The good news is that this is actually a tractable problem. You can measure noise and you can reduce noise. And here's what's beautiful about noise. Unlike bias, you don't need to know the truth to reduce noise. To reduce bias, you need to know the true value, right? You need to know what is correct. If we've made a forecast and we forecast on average, 5% GDP growth, I won't know what the bias is in the forecast until we are at the end of next year and I found out that the actual growth was +3, so my bias was +2. So, in many cases, I have to wait, or in fact, it's impossible to know what the true value is. Take the example of the judges again. I can't reduce the bias if I don't have an idea of what the true sentences should be. Maybe you think that on average, the sentences are too harsh in your country, and maybe I think that on average, the sentences are too lenient. Maybe you think that for certain types of crimes, maybe you think that on average for rape, sentences are too lenient, and on average for drug offenses, they are too severe. That would be an example of bias. But to have that discussion, we need to have a standard of what the true value, what the correct sentence for these different types of crimes would be. And that's very hard to have. Without knowing that, and without discussing that, and without having any idea what the correct sentence would be for any particular type of crime, we can both agree that wide variations in the sentences that are given by different judges to the same crimes are a problem. Noise is a problem even if we don't know what bias is. So even in situations where we don't know, and even in situations where we cannot define what the correct answer would be, which are the bulk of judgment problems, we can take steps to reduce noise because noise is always bad. Variability is always bad, even when you don't know what the true value is. I think that's important to bear in mind because it's actually not intuitive. We tend to think that to reduce errors, we first need to know what the error is. Right? It's kind of odd to say, I can improve your forecasts without knowing how wrong they are. But in fact, I can. If I make the 10 forecasts of 10 forecasters in the same institution less noisy, I will have reduced error, at least if you measure it the correct way, which is the mean squared error. I will have reduced error in the same manner that I would if I reduce the average error. Now, I will not have done anything to bias. The average error will still be what it is, but I will have reduced the mean squared error, which is one standard way of measuring error, and probably the appropriate one in this case. And that makes a big difference. And I will have reduced, if I'm talking about something like the justice system, I will have reduced the random component of the sentencing, the lottery of sentencing, which is probably a good thing to do. So how would you do that? First, you would need to measure it and do what we call a noise audit. I've mentioned it. A noise audit is essentially an experiment where you give the same cases to different judges and you measure how different their judgments are. You can do this with forecasts, you can do this with sentences, you can do this with grading essays, you can do this with medical diagnoses, you can do this with fingerprints, you can do this with any kind of judgment where you can take the same case and show it to different people, and you measure how big the discrepancies are. If you find that they're not that large, that the amount of noise that you find is actually tolerable from an operational point of view, you're fine. You don't need to do anything, right? I mean, we encourage you to measure it. We think that more often than not, you're going to find that it's bigger than you think. But if it's not a problem, then there's nothing to do. That's good news. Now, if it is a problem, there's a number of things you can do, and we call those things, we have a sort of headline for those things that you mentioned, which we call decision hygiene. The reason we have this slightly off-putting name, and it's intentionally off-putting, is to remind you that it's a little bit tedious, right? It's not going to be fun all the time. It's going to be fun at times, but it's not going to be fun all the time. It's a bit like washing your hands, right? We know that we should wash our hands, especially in the middle of a pandemic. But if you work in a hospital, you know that you should wash your hands frequently, and you observe, sadly, that people are sometimes not doing it as regularly and as well and as frequently as they should because it's a bit boring. And here's where the analogy is important. When you wash your hands, you don't know what problem you're solving. It's prevention. You're not actually saying, hey, here is the COVID germ that I've eliminated, and here's the bacteria for that disease that I've taken up. I've gotcha. So you don't say that. It's prevention. If it works, you will never know what it accomplished. If it works, you will never know what disease you've avoided. Now, contrast this with bias. If I say, oh, there is a bias in your organization, you have a gender bias in your recruiting, you are hiring far too many men and not enough women, we're going to fix this. You see the problem, you measure the problem, you fix the problem. That feels good, right? You've solved the problem of bias. Bias is something you can see. It has a cause. It is identifiable. Noise is very hard to see. And if you succeed at reducing it, you will not easily know what progress you've made. You will need to do another noise audit to measure how much progress you've made. So noise reduction, the prevention of noise, decision hygiene as we call it, is essentially prevention. It's redesigning your decision process to incorporate noise reduction practices that are going to make your decisions better without knowing exactly what problems you're avoiding.
And a lot of people listening to this will work in compliance and audit and risk and sort of control functions. And so very often, the way that we check things are working is, have we followed a due process? We very often don't question the basis of that process and say to ourselves, actually, so there's almost an implicit presumption we have designed this thing perfectly. And when we have people not following procedure, we have bad people and we need to just reprogram the people. We don't go and question necessarily the efficacy of the process and the design of the process. And what I find really interesting is you're talking here, if I were to take just the humble meeting as an example, which has a traditional structure, you're basically saying, actually, you should look at the way you do these things, because a lot of conventional wisdom around what works potentially might not.
Yeah, and when you say rethink the process, we're all for process, just to be clear. A lot of those decision hygiene practices if implemented, are going to result in processes. And in fact, some people are concerned when they hear about this, about the danger of adding bureaucracy and adding red tape. And that is, they're right. This is a danger, and this is something that is a trade-off, and we should be very careful about that trade-off. We don't want to kill all initiative and eliminate all sense of autonomy and agency in people. And that's a very serious concern. At the extreme, the way to eliminate noise that would work would be to simply eliminate any human judgment and to automate everything, right? And that would solve the problem of noise. In fact, it's the only way that would eliminate noise entirely, because when we say wherever there is judgment, there is noise, that means that the only way you can totally eliminate noise is by eliminating judgment. So let's assume that we don't want to go there, and we could argue about the many reasons why we don't want to go there, but let's assume that we're going to, since this is about human risk, as you call it, let's assume that we're talking about human judgment and not about replacing humans with machines. That is going to mean having some processes, and what we suggest is rethink those processes, rethink those rules, rethink those ways of working to make sure that they actually address noise, not just biases that you've identified and that you want to combat. You should do that, that's fine, but also that you address noise. Let's take the example of the meeting, as you were talking about. A very simple practice in meetings that you can adopt tomorrow morning in any meeting is, before people give their opinion on whatever it is that the meeting is discussing, have them write down their independent judgments on what the decision should be, on what the outcome should be. Do not let them influence each other as much as you typically do before they speak. It's not even a process, right? I mean, you could call this a process, but this is really a meeting management technique. This will do a lot to make sure that you hear the noise, that you hear the diversity. Then use a number of possible techniques to aggregate those judgments. You could use the technique that is sometimes called estimate, talk, estimate, where you have those independent judgments, then you ask people to explain their judgments and to justify their different points of view, and you again ask them to make another estimate and then take the average of those estimates. That's a pretty simple way to run meetings. It's not a complicated, Delphi method or something like that. It's simple. You could do this in any decision meeting about setting a number or setting a price or something like that. That's one example. In meetings, we typically have norms and procedures and rules. They are not designed to reduce noise. They're designed to reduce disagreement. And noise is disagreement. So you want to make sure that you express the disagreement before you come to a conclusion, and not that you suppress it. Here's another example. Hiring processes. I'll tell you a story. Actually, I think I think it's a funny story. I was working with a big startup. I mean, probably by now a unicorn, that was working on its hiring processes. So how do they decide to hire people? And being a young, modern, and trendy company, they've got a pretty thorough system where they've got different people interviewing each candidate, and they've done a very good job of structuring their recruiting process. So what we would advise on something like that is have a structured process where you know what dimensions you're looking at in candidates, and you know what you value and what you don't care about, and make sure that you evaluate the candidates independently in the various dimensions. And since they were a high-tech company, they had a system, an IT system, where they would enter all their judgments separately, and they told me, see, this is very easy. We can't influence each other because we all enter our grades into the system separately. And I thought, well, it's really impressive. And then I looked at how the system was parameterized. It turns out that by default, the way this HR management system was parameterized was that it gave people the option to go back to their grades and revisit it after looking at the grades that others had given. So what people on a team would do would be, yes, they would put in the grades after each interview, but then their boss would see the candidate, and the boss would enter, no, terrible candidate, not up to our exacting standards, And they would go back and quickly say, oh my God, I've been too lenient with that guy. Let's bring the grades down. And in the end, they had perfect agreement, right? So the devil's in the details when you're talking about those kinds of processes, and the devil is in the culture, right? Because why were these people doing that? Because they feared disagreement, because they didn't have the psychological safety of standing up to their boss and saying, hey, you said that candidate was not good on this skill. Actually, I gave him a case on that skill and he really impressed me. And we should talk about that because we have a disagreement here. We should get to the bottom of it. And maybe we need to give another test to that candidate, or maybe you didn't give that candidate a test and you will change your mind, or maybe we need a third person to give us a different opinion. But let's have a fact-based disagreement and resolve that disagreement instead of suppressing the disagreement. That's a very down-to-earth example, but I think it shows that if you're thinking about processes that reduce noise, you need to really fine-tune them to make sure that you express those views and that you resolve them in a fact-based way.
But I love that example because clearly some thought was given on some level to that particular. I mean, they might have bought the software and that here's a useless feature that we're never going to use, and it doesn't matter because we can override it. But somebody's designed this thing in a way that starts down that path, and then, as you say, it actually the outcome. So you'd almost have a confidence that, well, we have a system that allows you to input independently, so we're good, right? We have solved the problem, and actually you've made it worse.
And actually you've made it not worse, but you've missed an opportunity to make it better at least. And when you design processes, you really need to take care of that. Here's another example. Recruiting, or let's take performance evaluations. Most companies would have something like a 360-degree system by now. And many of them have some kind of rule to manage what we call level noise, which is the fact that many people, in fact, will tend to give inflated grades, will give the best grade to everyone because it saves them the trouble of having difficult conversations, or maybe it helps them get rid of someone they want to get rid of because he has a good mark and therefore he can be promoted. But, there's all sorts of motives to give people good marks. So an easy way to solve this problem, which a lot of companies have implemented, is to say, you're not allowed to do that. You have to have a forced distribution of your grade. Right? So you have to have on your team 10% of people who are in the bottom of category, and you can't have more than 20% who are in the top category. Sorry, I know all you people are great, but it's only 20% of A's, and it needs to be 70% of B's, and it must be at least 10% of C's or something like that. Lots of companies have put in place something like that. Does that reduce noise? Well, I'm not so sure. It reduces the kind of noise that is very easy to see, which is this level noise, as we call it. The fact that, on average, Christian gives an A to everybody because he's a kind, caring manager, and Olivier, who is a horrible guy, gives, on average, a B- to everybody. Okay, so we solved that problem. But here's the issue. If in your team, Christian, because you're such a great manager, all the people are actually very good, and in my team, because I'm an abysmally bad manager, all the people tend to actually be quite bad because no one wants to work with me and I don't develop my people very well, and people who aren't so good tend to gravitate towards people who aren't so good either, and vice versa. So if we actually have very different levels in our teams, forcing a differentiated and equivalent set of grades onto those two different groups is going to create a lot of error. You're going to make a lot of errors in forcing B and C grades on people who deserve an A, and I'm going to be forced to give an A to people who deserve a B or a C. This sort of quick fix is not going to solve your problem. You need something more refined than that. So again, processes will help quite often, but you need to design the processes in a way that really reduces noise, not in a way that superficially gives you the impression that, hey, we've taken care of the process, so it must be fine.
Love that. And that example you've just given, a ton of thoughts, all of which I recognize the dynamics you're talking about. And you're right, it is prevalent. And I view it a little bit like unconscious bias training, where we think it's a good idea. And you said, let's get this done, let's put this in place, and then we've solved that problem. And as you say, actually, these things are a little bit more complex. So I think that was a great example that listeners will absolutely recognize, many of whom I used to work with in various institutions. So thank you for that.
Performance management systems are a fascinating topic. We've got an entire chapter of the book about them. It's fascinating because it's something that almost everybody realizes is broken. And there's almost unanimous agreement among people who are evaluated and among people who are doing the evaluations that it's a terrible system, that's a waste of time, that demotivates people and that produces crappy data. And yet everybody keeps doing it. It's mind-boggling.
Right. No, I agree. Before I let you go, a couple more questions. The first one is, I'm absolutely intrigued as to how do you get a professorial supergroup together to write this book? What was the genesis of bringing you all together?
Well, let me subtitle your question. You're intrigued as to how I got myself sandwiched between Danny and Cass, who are the professional superstars.
Not at all. No, I'm just intrigued as to sort of how that works, because.
No, but I'm kidding. But I'm very aware that I'm the lucky member of the trio here. And here's the backstory so you understand. Danny had been thinking about this topic for a while, and frankly, he's the first one who saw the potential of this topic. And I'd been coming at it from a different angle, which people who've read my previous book, You're About to Make a Terrible Mistake, will realize. My thinking was, I'm trying to help companies get rid of biases. But actually, there are a lot of situations where it's not clear what bias is tripping them. What is the problem? Yes, there are some situations where, if you're making plans, they are probably too optimistic. We know the direction of the error there. And if you are making hiring decisions, we sort of know what typical biases you're going to run into. But there were also lots of cases where it wasn't clear which way it would go. If you were making a big investment, yes, you could be too optimistic about the prospects for the investment, but you could also be too conservative because of loss aversion or because of other biases. So my sort of take on this was, you need to think about the process by which you make decisions, because you don't really know what biases you're dealing with. And when we started talking about this with Danny, it didn't suddenly, but it gradually dawned on me that what I was dealing with here was a different statistical problem from the problem of bias. It wasn't predictable average error. It was, in fact, a random error caused by a lot of different psychological biases that a lot of different people could bring to bear in their decisions. So intellectually, that's how we got together. I was coming at this from the point of view of helping organizations deal with the effects of psychological bias. And I was realizing that the effects of the psychological biases were often what we now call noise. And Danny was seeing this from a different perspective, which was the perspective of the insurance company that we're talking about in the book, where people were not aware of noise. And he was thinking, well, how fascinating from a psychological standpoint that people are not aware of this problem. So we started talking about this, in fact, quite a while ago, about 5 years ago now, Danny and I. And initially, we didn't think there would be a book. We thought there might be an article, but we weren't actually certain that there would be an article. And gradually, we realized that this was a much larger problem than we had thought. It wasn't just a problem of companies and underwriters and so on. It was also a problem of justice, and a problem of medicine, and a problem of childcare agencies, which we haven't talked about, and a problem of patent offices, and a problem in all kinds of walks of life, which are really a problem that society should care about. And that's when we thought, we need someone who can help us think about the political, the legal, the philosophical ramifications of this. And it so happened that Danny and Cass had worked together in the past, and Cass had gently indicated that if we invited him to join the team, he would be very excited. And Danny also thought that having 3 authors would be better than 2, because 2 of us could perhaps sometimes tell him that he was wrong. And which didn't happen very often, but still. And it's harder for just one of us to push back against Danny. So that's how we came to be a team of three. And personally, I've always worked in teams all my life. I've always found it to be great fun and to be a lot more fun than working alone. And it's been an amazing privilege to work with that team. This is quite a team to be on.
Well, I think you're very clearly deserving participant of that, because as people will have heard on this podcast, you're a phenomenally great explainer of complicated things in very, very simple ways and engaging ways. And thank you for doing that. I'm intrigued as to what's next for you. I know you're busy doing lots of promotion for the book and thinking about it, but where's your sort of research thinking beyond this?
Well, it's a bit it's going in several directions. One of the topics, obviously, that I'm thinking about is what's next about noise. So how do you actually help organizations tackle noise? We've tried to make the book very practical. In fact, a lot more practical than previous books by any one of us. And we even have appendices that give detailed manuals for how to do a noise audit and how to observe decision making and so on. So we've tried to make this practical, but as we clearly say in the book, this is the beginning of what we hope is going to be a strand of research that a lot of people are going to care about, both in terms of conceptually and academically trying to understand the causes of noise, and also in more practical managerial terms, in terms of how to actually reduce noise, what works. So we talk, for instance, about structuring decisions. We talk about aggregating multiple judgments. We talk about sequencing information that you expose people to. We talk about selecting different judges or training judges to be better at making their judgments. We talk about lots of ways to reduce noise that are all part of decision hygiene. But we can't say today, in a prescriptive way, given your situation, you could do this and this, but not that, that, and that, which are not going to be useful to you. We also can't tell you, if you do this, you will reduce noise by X%. We have examples, but there is still a lot of research to do on making this work better. And I've done some of that research with some companies, but I hope I'm going to do more of it in the future. And another thing that I'm thinking about quite a bit these days, which echoes some of my previous work and also some of the stuff that we talk about in noise, is how do people, or why do people who work in management, in companies, remain blind for so long to things like noise? There are a few examples. We have the example of the insurance company. We have the example of hiring. We have the example of performance evaluations. These are things that are broken. They are broken in these cases because of noise. They're also broken because of other things. And everybody behaves as if they are not. No one seems to do anything about it. Oh, no one is too strong. But a lot of people seems to be happy doing the same thing that they were doing and not challenging something that evidently doesn't work, that we have a ton of research to show is broken, that, by the way, has been shown to be broken a long time ago, that academics don't even do research about because it's been clear for a long time now that that this doesn't work, this isn't the way to do it. But academia has left and moved on to something else 10, 20, or 30 years ago. The world of management is still stuck there. And that gap, that chasm between what scientifically we now know doesn't work, and sometimes we now know works, and what is actually done, is a topic that intrigues me and that I want to think about.
Wow. I would love to see that, because that just makes me smile as a thing, because I think anybody listening who's worked for any sort of moderately sized company, or even smaller ones, I guess, but particularly larger companies, will absolutely recognize what you're saying.
Well, anyone like you, Christian, and anyone like, I guess, your listeners, which I think is part of the problem. Some people, the kind of people who listen to your podcast, I would think, have the intellectual curiosity to question the way things are done. But if they don't have that curiosity, they are not pushed by organizations, by systems, etc., to find new ways or to challenge the old ways. So, you smile, but a lot of people, when I ask them about this, they don't smile. They just frown and and say, "Well, what are you talking about? Well, there's something wrong with the way I do recruiting? No, I'm not aware of that." That's the issue.
Right. Well, I can't. Well, listen, please go ahead and do that, because I think that would be amazing. Listen, Olivier, time as ever with you flies. Thank you so much for spending time, because I know you're incredibly busy. I will obviously put links to Noise. I will put links to your previous book as well and some of your other research as well, because I do want to draw people's attention to that, and obviously the previous episode of the show that you were on. But listen, thank you very much for what you've done. I think you've stimulated some fascinating debate. You've made me think and made me smile, which is a great combination. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Christian. This was fun.
So that's it for another episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to Olivier for appearing, and to you for listening. To find out more about Olivier, his areas of research, his other writings, and of course Noise, have a look in the show notes. There are links to those there. If you missed his previous appearance on the show, have a look. There's a link to that in the show notes as well. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. If you like the show and have yet to leave a 5-star review for it, please do so. It really does help. To find out more about Human Risk, visit human-risk.com, and you can read about the work that I do with my clients, subscribe to the Human Risk newsletter, and see the Human Risk video blog and blogs on the website. I'll be back very soon with another episode of this podcast. But in the meantime, stay safe, try and avoid noise, and thanks for listening.